Thinking Global, Engaging Evidence in Policymaking Towards the SDGs, convened by the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health in partnership with UN agencies in Malaysia. Now on its third year, the seminar series provides a forum for intellectual discussion about the work of the UN towards the achievement of the SDGs and brings together various voices from academics, researchers, and civil societies across Malaysia to meet and engage with their relevant counterparts in the UN system. Mrs. Manon Bernier, who is the UNDP Deputy Residence Representative for Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam, is joining us today. Mrs. Bernier has 17 years of experience with UNDP and UN volunteer program serving in Latin America, Europe, and Asia. She joined UNDP Malaysia management team in September 2020, supporting national stakeholders in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. She leads the development of innovative programs and partnerships to accelerate structural transformation for sustainable development and build evidence for informed policy design and implementation. Prior to that, she established the first UNV regional office for Asia and the Pacific based in Bangkok. She led the strategic development of a new program portfolio integrating volunteerism as an avenue for participation and inclusion of citizens and communities in the achievement of the SDGs. She was also overseeing the deployment of over 1,000 UN volunteers and managed UNV support to UN agencies in the COVID-19 response across the Asia-Pacific region. In the context of South-South cooperation, she developed groundbreaking cooperation with China, Thailand, and Brazil, as well as steered innovative partnership with engagement of the private sector. She also served in Latin America, managing portfolios of projects on decentralization, local governance, and women's economic empowerment. So welcome to our webinar, Mrs. Bernier. And maybe before we start, some housekeeping rules. First, you can join this conversation on Twitter, on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook. If you have any questions that we hope you do, please send us through any of these social media platforms. For example, in Twitter, you just need to go to the @UNU_IIGH and live tweet using the hashtags Working Local, Thinking Global, Evidence to Policy, or SDGs. And you can watch the live stream in the social media and also pose your questions there. So as a reminder, tell us in the chat your name and where you are from, and write your questions also in the Q&A box, alternatively if you don't use the social media. Share your thoughts and comments in the chat box, express yourselves with emoji, and participate and enjoy this webinar. So Mrs. Bernier, the floor is yours.
A very good afternoon to you. First, let me thank UNU for this invitation and this initiative to bring the different UN agencies together to share our experience and how we work local and think global, and how we are more specifically engaging evidence in policymaking towards the SDGs. So it's a real pleasure to join you today. I will do a brief presentation. I think I have around 10 slides to try to share with you some examples. First, introducing briefly UNDP and UNDP in the context that we live in now, the very challenging development context that we live in now. And after, I will give some specific example of how in UNDP we are trying to approach the complexity of development challenges that we are facing at the moment, as well as use different ways of engaging evidence to help inform policymaking. And then, of course, I think the most interesting part is actually the interaction with all of you. So would be happy to hear your feedback. From what I understand as well, when we were preparing the session with UNU, that Partnership is at the heart of what UNDP does, and we hope that some of the ideas that I will share today and some of the initiatives we are working on can also inspire further collaboration with some of you that are in the room today. So I think we can start. If we can put the first slide. I think you are looking at the slide. Just to start, with the bigger picture, as we say in UNDP, and the very changing development landscape that we are living now, that actually has been even more reinforced over the last few years, but was there even post-pandemic, with really an increased complexity of development challenges and trends that are affecting the statu quo and the achievement of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think we have had a big setback over the last few years. But even before, we had the climate emergencies. We see societal polarizations and also a big rise in inequalities that has really taught us, when the SDGs were created, that we cannot look at development challenges in isolation, and that they are all interconnected. And I think this was even more reinforced with COVID-19, which was first approached as a health crisis, but very, very quickly, governments and stakeholders realized this is much more complex. Like, a health crisis is already complex, but has ramification in so many different sectors, and it's a socio-economic context, it's an inclusion context, and we have seen millions of people going back into poverty as a result of COVID-19. And just in the recent month, UNDP has just released a report where we estimate that with the disruptions of energy and food markets from March until now, until the end of June, actually, there is 71 million more people adding on to the 100 millions already that have gone back to below the poverty line in the world. So this is quite a concerning actually situation, that we have the SDG that is actually the roadmap to help all of us and help the world becoming reduce poverty, reduce inequality, and become more sustainable. And that, unfortunately, over the last few years, instead of moving towards those goals, we are actually going back in a number of sectors. So I think the urgency to take the Sustainable Development Goal seriously has never been that urgent, and also really calls for different ways of working and looking at development in a much more integrated way, involving all sectors of society, stronger connections between the academia and government and civil society, where we're still struggling in most of countries in the world, still a very siloed approach to problems. So next slide. So what do we do at UNDP? Some of you might know us already, but we actually work in 170 countries now, and we're helping to eradicate poverty, reduce inequalities and exclusion, and build resilience, so that countries can sustain progress. And I think, of course, our core mandate, and this graph is actually a nice illustration of our strategic framework, which used to be 60 pages of text, and now I think can very well be summarized with this graph, where we will focus our next 5 years, 2022 to 2025, of course, to continue support the 2030 agenda, which remains our end goal, and as I explained earlier, I think remains the most important agenda for the world if we still want to have a planet in a few years' time. And how we want to achieve, how we want to contribute, what we see will be the main direction of travels that we need to influence if we want to achieve the SDGs, is that we need a structural transformation. We need to make sure that policies and resources are allocated with a focus on leaving no one behind on the last milestone of poverty, and also that our interventions are helping building resilience of countries to future shocks. The pandemic was one. Climate change, we see it. You have seen the apocalyptic images of we got from Europe recently with the heat waves, but there are floods. There are so many others we see every day all over the world being affected by climate change, and how can we build that resilience? So these are the three journey travels of that we want to influence on the right side of the graph. But as I mentioned, to be able to do that, we cannot take the same approach of development that we used to have, with very isolated portfolio of colleagues working on environment only with the Ministry of Environment, others working on energy, others working on governance. We need a much more integrated approach. So if you take the left side of the graph, this is our traditional areas of work in UNDP, what we call our six signature solutions. No? What is different with this new strategic framework is that we look at the interconnection of them, and we work much more intensively on what we call the three enablers, the one that are highlighted in blue: digitalization, innovation, strategic innovation, and development financing. If we want to develop integrated solutions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we will need to leverage on technology. We'll need development financing, which goes much beyond the government investment, but looking at all the different financing flows, and use creativity and strategic innovation to drive that change. So these new enablers, actually, we have started working on them before the new strategic plan, but this is now at the heart of the way we work at UNDP to try to really come up with much more integrated solution to the scale of the development challenges that we are facing. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about UNDP in Malaysia, actually we are present in Malaysia since 1965. So it's been quite a long time. We have been, of course, as a UN organization, our main counterpart is the national governments. And we have been working on inclusive growth, environment, climate change, sustainable economy, and good governance. And of course, as the SDG call for much broader stakeholder engagement and approach, we have been widely broadening our engagement, working from both federal, subnational level, as well local governance, as well as with the private sector, academia, and civil society organization. And basically our work supports the whole UN cooperation framework for Malaysia around the 5 pillars of the SDGs: no? People, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. No? So for those who would like to know more about the specific programs, I invite you to visit our website. But for this conversation, we have agreed to focus, to deep dive on some very specific examples that illustrates how we are using evidence to inform policymaking. No? So next. So one of the area, and you see here the title, Portfolio, Poverty Eradication and Inequality Reduction. So we have started working, instead of isolated projects, to look at a portfolio approach when we try to look at integrated issue in specific areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in my next presentation. So I will introduce each of the 4 portfolio with one example each on how we are using evidence and data. So the first portfolio, as I've mentioned, is around poverty eradication and inequality. And one of the initiatives, and I think one of the key, I would say, initial steps if we want to address poverty, is really what measure are we going to take, and what data are we going to use to measure poverty, because the way we measure poverty will actually shape how we understand poverty and what are the different strategies to address it. No? So UNDP for several years has been collaborating with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative on what we call the multi-dimensional poverty index, which is an index that collects data on indicators beyond household incomes to measure incidence and intensity of poverty, beyond household income. So it will look at areas, for example, of health, education, and living standards. So one of the projects that we have with the government of Malaysia right now is to help review. Malaysia has a national, what we call national MPI. The methodology is a global one that can be tailored and adapted to different development setting. It was initially thought for low-income countries, but the methodology is flexible and help adapts to different contexts. So this is what we are helping and working with the government of Malaysia to review the national MPI, to expand the existing dimension and indicators to be so that they can be more comprehensive, and also so that they can better reflect new dimension of poverty. For example, 20 years ago, no one would think digital is a sine qua non conditions to be access to have access to development. But if you took COVID, obviously one of the main learning is that those who were not connected digitally were actually excluded from schools, excluded from market, from so many different basic as well, could lead as well to access to basic needs like and services like education. So this is one of the reasons why the government wants to review the NPI, and we are working with them based on this global methodology. And at the end, of course, it's a local level decision. But what's important is that beyond developing and selecting the indicators, they can be known and used to inform planning, implementation, and monitoring of policy alleviation measures. No? So, of course, we hope that some of you in the room will be part. There will be consultations to actually look at those indicators, and we hope that some of you will be engaged as well with us. And once the MPI is adopted by Malaysia, that it will need to be disseminated. We will have capacity building, advocacy as well, activities, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't help inform decision making and program design, then there's no point of having the MPI. So this is one of the first initiative of how we are using data to inform policymaking. The second portfolio, yeah, you can move to the second one, next slide, is all our work on social protection. No? So this one, actually, during COVID pandemic, I'm going to use the example and the initiative that we are supporting on temporary basic income, which, during the COVID pandemic, UNDP has advocated, for TBI scheme as, a relevant mechanism that can relieve financial security to the most affected in society by the pandemic. And I think beyond, cash transfer via TBI or others was really enacted during the crisis at global scales and in several countries. And I think there's quite a lot of lessons learned that we can get from several experiences in the world. And Malaysia here, especially in Sarawak, has implemented the program Bantuan Kas Sarawaku Sayang, sorry for my pronunciation, which was a program all led by the Sarawak government and has really provided a direct cash transfer to the most vulnerable one in Sarawak. And this example that's really falls under the definition of a temporary basic income, which can put in place rapidly in terms of crisis and can really help buffer the immediate shock of crisis. So we are working with the Sarawak government to actually help assess the impact of the TBI that was this burden that has just ended not very long ago. And really, hopefully, the experience from Sarawak can help other states in Malaysia, but also become an example for other countries in the world. So I think learning from successful experience and making those experiences available for other governments and the rest of the world is another approach that UNDP takes to act local, think global, and act local. I think we can go to so that's the second one. So we've had the MPI, then the TBI. We have a lot of acronyms in UNDP. The third one is actually on our portfolio on urban sustainability and ecosystem resilience. The example that I want to give is the ecological fiscal transfer, what we call EFT. For those who are not familiar or not working on the environment field, it's a form of intergovernmental fiscal transfer where revenues are redistributed among the different level of government agreed according to agreed principles and priorities by all stakeholders. No? So EFT has been practiced since the 1990s in several countries in the world, in Brazil, Portugal, France, China, and India. So for several years now, using these experiences and also UNDP work at state level on protected areas in Malaysia. We have made the case and work with government for transfer schemes from federal to state government to improve conservation at the state level. And that was, of course, at the request as well from the government, who was looking at some fiscal incentive for state level to invest more in conservation and restoration. And in 2021, actually it started in 2019, if I recall, it was announced in the first budget, and then in 2021, 70 million was announced by the government for ecological fiscal transfer, and with an increase in budget 21 to 100 million ringgits. UNDP now is helping, so we're very glad to see how first, those mechanisms are critical to address climate change and really have a strong focus on conservation, and second, to see that some practices that we were able to help the government define its own ecological fiscal transfer mechanism based on good practices from all over the world, but also adapted to the Malaysian government. So this year in 2021, because actually the mechanism now is launched, but how do you implement it? How do you monitor implementation? What criteria do you define to allocate the transfer? So UNDP now is continue to work with the government of Malaysia, with the Ministry of Finance and the state level ministries to help in the implementation of the ecological fiscal transfer. So that's our fourth portfolio. Another example. And now I would like to speak on our fourth portfolio, which is around sustainable and responsible value change. I think we hear more and more the need. We really strive at UNDP to promote a more sustainable and responsible value across the value chain. This goes from advisory on human rights, on SDG finance, on impact investment, but also on further engaging with the private sector and promoting the digitalization agenda. So another way that we consider to use evidence for policy making is really working from the bottom up approach. and going down to the communities and really map user experience and system mapping to address local development needs. So, because only policy from global level cannot necessarily fit always the local needs, and really need to feed global practice with bottom up approach. So when COVID hit, um, we know that several small businesses and producers, especially in remote areas, in rural areas, were completely isolated and cut. Their supply chain was completely cut by the impacted by the pandemic. So, in partnership with UNCDF, we worked in both Sarawak and Sabah to actually map what is the value change for those communities, and really starting from the producer to the different intermediary, and then start really doing a system map, and what were the levers that needed to be, what could be digitalized, and how, and what were the conditions that were needed to make digitalization open much beyond technology, because we know that technology on its own doesn't bring inclusion if you don't work on the different conditions around, including a culture shift. Like most of them had never used online banking system, digital literacy, digital banking system, and then how that would actually affect the whole supply chain, like the whole value chain as well. So by mapping the really looking at the user-centric designed program in both Sarawak and Sabah, we did work with local stakeholders and communities to onboard rural entrepreneurs to the e-commerce, and have launched. This is an image. We are now on Shopee. This is some of the online businesses that were created. No, they were not created. They were transitioned to e-onboarding during the pandemic. And I think very often when we use technology, when we talk about digitalization, we only think about the technology that we are going to introduce, and there is not enough attention to actually the whole surrounding environment that is required to make that technology successful. And we always say, if you don't design for inclusion, technology is not going to give you inclusion. So I think for us to be able to have our program and project using user-centric design methodologies is at the core of the programs that we design now, because they help going back to addressing the complexity. If you talk about digital onboarding, you also talk about access to energy. If there is no electricity, then how do you bring them on board? So it helps you to really look in a much more systemic way at the development challenge, and then being able to impact different points along the system to achieve your result. So this is the fourth example that I wanted to bring around data and evidence. And those two initiatives have been actually quite successful, and now are being scaled up with other partners as well. Next. So I gave you four examples around the four portfolio that we implement right now in UNDP. But there is one, I would say, cross-cutting that I really want to bring up, because it's at the heart of what we do in UNDP. Gender, if we exclude 50% of the population in the intervention, and we don't analyze from a gender lens the different program interventions that we do, the chances of having half of our beneficiary excluded, not necessarily with bad intention, but because we just don't see some of the barriers that impact woman equality, gender equality, and women empowerment. So from all our project intervention now, we do start by making sure we integrate gender analysis as part of our program design. So from collecting disaggregated baseline data on gender, tracking outcomes as well by gender. And also, so this is something that we do across our program and portfolio, and we strongly believe that without making a specific gender effort or putting our gender lens that we call, it will it if what is not visible doesn't exist, no. So if you are not able to measure and highlight, you will not be able to get accurate data on how a particular development issues is impacting men and women in different ways because of the different conditions that they are in. So same thing during the pandemic, actually. When everything was going online, we have worked together with Talent Corp to looked at what had been the impact of the pandemic on flexible work arrangement for women, and what could be some of the recommendation. At that time, we didn't know how long this was going to last, if it was temporary or not, and we wanted to see if this had a positive, negative impact, and if positive, then what needs to be, what else can be done, no, and make some policy recommendation that can last post crisis and post COVID, no. So that surely remains an area for us of interest as well, to work with partners. We are in the process of formulating our gender strategy for our new country program. So we will be organizing some specific consultation. We want to hear from partners that are working on gender of specific interest. What data is available, how can we work, what should be the priority sector for us to work on, and we'll be happy to engage with partners on that front as well. Next. Okay. I have mentioned the different portfolios that we are working on, and now I want to explain a little bit what's our portfolio approach, and connecting it to what I was explaining at the beginning, that we cannot approach the development challenges as business as usual from one angle, but we really need to look at system analysis to understand the different drivers and what kind of signal we can collect. So I just want to give a quick example here. If we take the issue of capacity for family to provide elderly care, no, we know that Malaysia is an aging society, no. So traditionally, we would look at the household income, the caregiving responsibilities, and then, for example, no, at minimum data to say if a household can provide, care to the elderly. Taking a system analysis approach will help us to identify connections between the capacity of family to provide care with much more broader issues and thematics. And the way we do it is by analyzing the signal, what we call David always call it the different signal that we can get through data, through media, through social media trends that we see, through media analysis and others, and see what are some of the signal that could also impact. And in this one, for example, you would see that if we look at signals and some data that are available, you see that the average new homes is the smallest now than in 2009. So, capacity for supporting elderly is also linked to the size of the household that you can actually have, or the physical house or home that you can actually have. That's also an impact. Also, if you browse through the news, some signal that you get is that now property developers are expecting more demand for office space. So does that mean that people are going back to office, and will the flexible working arrangement still continue if you want to be able to give care to young people? Then you would also looked at the number of social care worker stagnating. So, the labor market as well, analysis, and how another one is how women are opting or not for flexible working arrangements. So just looking at a very different signal and system approach help have a much more comprehensive view on development challenges. And we want to use this approach for our four portfolio, on poverty reduction, on social protection, on environmental sustainability, and on supply chain. So we want to create intelligence around those portfolio that we could run on a periodic basis to help us stay abreast, because very often, you're very forward looking as a development partner, and then you start your project and then you lose that perspective, while the world is constantly changing. So how can we integrate in, how can we work with partners, and here are open for comments and ideas, in making sure we keep abreast of those signals and we can adjust our intervention accordingly as development challenges change, and the rapid speed of change that we live in at the moment. So this is the way we are working within UNDP right now, and our attempt to support the Malaysian government and work with national stakeholders in the complex road to achieve the SDGs. So in summary, just to summarize the recap, the key messages from my presentation: why data and evidence matter. I think through the NPI, we saw that what we measure shape how we understand and approach sustainable development programs. So I think working with academia and other stakeholders and in questioning the data and disaggregating the data and identify which data exactly do we need is critical. Then through the TBI, we have looked at how we can learn from successful experiences, and that can help inform other states or other countries in the world. And in that sense, Malaysia has very good example actually to offer in different areas, and UNDP can help promoting those ideas, like we are measuring actually and assessing the impact of some of those experiences like the TBI. Then the third example was the EFT, ecological fiscal transfer, when we saw that through several years and sustained engagement can actually have an impact and change policy, and using some global models adopted in other countries and tailor help the national stakeholders to adopt that model. The fourth one is the Sabah e-commerce project, where we actually really look at local data source and understand how to address local problems. And especially those I think are especially important with marginalized groups, where there are usually lack of data and gap within national statistics. So then our gender, of course, remains at the heart of our priorities, and how we need to continue and really look at gender as an integrated approach to all our, as a mainstreaming element of all our program interventions, and how we integrate system thinking within our portfolio. And I would say this is still also not new, but still I would say something that always needs to be improved and improve and learn from this system thinking approach, because I think there is more and more partners acknowledging it, but how you make it operational within your organization and much more systematic, I think still remain a challenge. So this gives you hopefully a good idea of what we are working on, what we are, I cannot say fighting for, but striving for, and together with, of course, national stakeholder in Malaysia. And I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Claudia. No?
Thank you, Mrs. Bernier. This was a fascinating presentation. It was really excellent that you walk us through these different portfolio of these comprehensive solutions to respond to the scale of development challenges. And I particularly like the fact that you stressed the importance of integrating gender and also systems thinking in all these different solutions. And these examples from Malaysia can be scaled to other countries, and we will also present examples from other countries that were applied in Malaysia. So I think this implementation and operationalization of these solutions is really important, I think, for our global audience. And we know that we have people listening to us from different parts of the world. We have people from Zambia, from other countries that I will maybe start with some questions. So we have a question from WK Young. Good afternoon. I'm a PhD candidate currently investigating the changing role of Malaysian business in delivering better ESGs outcome in a post-COVID landscape. I think is SDGs, outcomes in a post-COVID landscape. I would like to seek some comments or some input from UNDP or UNU of whether the institutions are keen to support sustainability-related research initiatives, particularly in terms of knowledge and data resource sharing. Thanks for your question.
Yeah. That's a very good question, Wang. And I did not talk about the ESG and sustainability, but we have a whole portfolio on SDG financing, impact investment, impact management, and measurement. So that's because I wanted to focus the presentation on a key, and it was hard to pick which one I would choose. But that is surely an area that is very important to UNDP, and we have a whole a team working on. For us, we go beyond ESG, to be honest, because ESG is a risk. Is very good for risk management. But I think if you want to drive impact, ESG, there is not a direct connection, necessarily a direct. It's not because you implement ESG, which is very important. Don't get me wrong. It will not necessarily lead to sustainability impact. So I think in terms of measuring outcome, this is at the heart of what UNDP is interested, is looking at how through the sustainability initiative and by incorporating sustainability in businesses, in impact investments, and we can actually drive more impact towards the SDGs. We have developed SDG standards for private sector, for bonds, for so there's a lot of resources available, and I would surely be interested in further exploring. No, if that answer, feel free to send me to be in contact after this to discuss further and share with you some resources that we have at UNDP.
Thanks for your answer, Mrs. Bernier. So we have another question from Su Han Teo. Thank you for the fascinating presentation, and I apologize if this is mentioned and I missed it, but what is the mechanism of EFT and how far does it involve bottom-up approach, if any?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. What is so the EFT is ecological fiscal transfer. So if you Google, actually you will see, and this is really this is linked to fiscal transfer, no? and how the government can transfer some of the revenue. They can be distributed from national level to subnational level, but with specific objective to actually address a conservation issue, because we know that state level are actually the one in charge for conservation and protection. So through the ecological fiscal transfer, this is how the mechanism is defined at the national level, but implemented at the subnational level. So they are now defining, because to be able to implement the mechanism, you need clear criteria, clear reporting mechanism, and of course then how those resources are allocated at the subnational level, no? So we are actually now in the next phase of a project that is being defined, where we will be piloting together with some state level and the national government the implementation of EFT. So I would not be able to give all the details, but I think if you go on UNDP website, you will have the information related to the EFT, and probably some names of the colleagues in the country office that are working on that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We have other questions from our social media platforms from Rajeshwari Malik. Nice presentation, Manan. Can you tell us about an initiative to spread awareness among children about SDGs so that we can have behavioral changes before they become decision makers? Thank you.
Okay. Good. It seems like all those questions are very relevant. Actually, UNDP, we work very closely with UNICEF is the one that has a specific mandate, no, to work on children, and they have also people working but we have a big program on youth. I think behavior change is very, very key. I've been participating in several as well. Conversation around the role of education on sustainable development and how we can drive more behavioral change. So we are just about actually to launch, if you're based in Malaysia, you'll see it in 2 weeks' time, a program called the Youth Environment Living Lab. It doesn't target only children, but it's a joint initiative, UNDP and UNICEF, to engage young people on climate change. And I think one of the first issue is that climate change is really a northern, still seen a bit as a northern. I'm Canadian, so I relate to the polar bear image of climate change, the polar bear dying on its little. But what does it mean exactly? In Malaysia, a polar bear doesn't really mean, doesn't resonate for the local context. So we are working through this program, Youth Environment Living Lab, to localize narrative on climate change, to raise awareness, and then build network of young people engage on climate change. There's already quite a number of youth organizations, and how we can help them strengthen and multiply their actions. We are also working with Alam, who has just commissioned with the Ministry of Education, actually, a study on education on sustainable development, to try to see how within the education system, formal and informal, more can be done to exactly reach this change of behavior and culture from and address it from the young age and education system as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, enough resources and food for thought. We have other question here from Mariam Haisha, I believe is from Malaysia. Hi, Mariam. Here we have been working extensively towards environmental sustainability and poverty prevention around the local community-owned university platform. Does UNDP co-fund or collaborate in such projects?
We have also been working intensively now in environment sustainability, both at local level and at the policy level. No? So of course, as I was explaining, a number of our intervention are at the policy level, but we also have, for example, now we are just finalizing a program by the Ministry of Finance on microgrant facility for Oranjasli community, where we have given grants to civil society organization, and can be academic institution as well, to work on environment, sustainability, and poverty, specifically with Oranjasli community. And we are about to launch others. So usually we would work with academia, either in partnership or through some grants programs that we may have at some point in time when we have resources. But we are also interested in seeing how we can join forces as well in partnership. Without necessarily partnership are not always around funding mechanism, but looking at complementarity, knowledge exchange as well, platform for dialogues. I think this is where as well we can engage more strongly with the academia. No, in the presentation I was sharing different areas where we would like to engage more with academia or other stakeholders in those. So collaboration, yes, for sure, under different areas, as I was explaining, and of course funding, depending on programs that we have out there, which all have call for proposal and selections criteria based on the thematic and all of this. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we are reaching to a end of the Q&A. I had only one question for you, Manon. It's just curiosity, because you talk about the integrated approach of gender and systems thinking, and you mentioned one specific project that integrates gender in terms of caregiving and flexible working arrangement. But what about the integrating gender in the other projects? I believe that multidimensional poverty index, you have sex disaggregated and also disaggregated by the other intersectional factors. You also mentioned the
Yes.
disaggregation. But what about the Sabah e-commerce? When you look at user experience and systems mapping, are you involving women, or in each ways, or what are the challenges to involving women, given that we know that women have certain barriers in terms of accessing and using technology due to social norms and roles? And I believe these are more rural populations. So do you have any experience on engaging women and on the use of technology and, for example, e-financing? And
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about that? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good question. And yes, actually, the two e-commerce project, to be very fair and honest, they were not initially designed with a gender. This was because it just happened so quickly when COVID hit, and we were looking for opportunities. But actually, very, very quickly in the design, most of the participants were actually women. So we actually had to take on that perspective just by reality check, and then we had to tailor intervention because some of them had to take care of like how to come to the, I know they had to organize a bit of a daycare so that the woman can participate in the training. We had to organize a digital literacy as well, because usually they are some of them didn't have any knowledge. Do pairing as well, young people with older women, because young people are more digital savvy. So we really had to analyze the specific conditions that were tailored. And actually, one where we're looking for partners, actually, we have a concept to actually really deepen that particular area of rural digital onboarding, to really do, because this was an assessment for a particular project, but we would like to do a much more thorough study and analysis that could help drive change at the bigger scales, no, for women rural entrepreneurs. Yeah.
Okay, excellent, Manon. I think we reached to the end of our session. Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to have you with us and sharing your experience and the work of UNDP, one of our partners in Malaysia. And we will have a next session next month in August. But before you go, please give us some feedback in terms of this webinar series. So you can use the QR code in your screen. And if you have any other queries, or if you want to get in touch with Manon for developing some of your questions, also please feel free to reach out to us through the emails events-IIGH@unu.edu. Thank you very much and have a good day.